Welcome back. In the previous session, we looked at the vasculature to the abdominal organs. In this session, we'll look at the posterior abdominal wall proper by looking at the musculature and the bones that make up this region. So just a bit of an overview, when we look at the posterior wall, we consider it to be composed of the lumbar vertebrae, first of all, which we spend a great deal of time talking about at this point in time, so we won't linger to the point. We also have the diaphragm in the superior region of the posterior abdominal wall. This we haven't had as much time to talk about, so we will be looking at that a bit today. And we also have a series of fibromuscular sheaths. So we have a couple of muscles in more of the inferior region of the posterior abdominal wall and the fascia that surrounds them. These are considered invaginations of the thoracolumbar fascia that are in this region sometimes referred to as the endo-abdominal fascia, and they get specific names based on the muscle that they're surrounding. And we'll actually find that this is actually a continuation of the transversalis fascia as well. But we'll piece all that together and see how that actually works. So looking at some of the muscles that we have in this region, first of all, we see the psoas major muscle. This is one that we previously identified when we were looking at the thigh. This originates off of the the transverse processes of T12 all the way through L5, and as it descends, it passes underneath the inguinal ligament and then fuses with the second muscle, the iliacus, to form the iliopsoas muscle. So now we finally see these two muscles from their actual origin points within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Another muscle that is sometimes seen, this is a type of vestigial muscle, and it's of very little importance, but you will see this tendon occasionally, so it is important to note. This is your psoas minor. So it's going to originate once again off the transverse processes, but then it attaches into the innominate bone rather than actually passing into the hip region. So just something to be aware of in case you do see this prominent tendon on top of the psoas major. Going out laterally, we see quadratus lumborum. This is named because of its quadrangular shape. Originates off the inferior surface of the 12th rib and then inserts on the iliac crest as well as the iliolumbar ligament. So this is going to serve as a lateral flexor of the trunk as well as stabilizer of the trunk in certain sorts of situations. We move out laterally from here and we see that the fascia surrounding the psoas major and the quadratus lumborum, this is going to continue on as our transversalis fascia. So if we were to actually look at this in cross-section, this is the sort of arrangement that we're going to see. Again, we have this anterior fascial layer of the psoas major and the quadratus lumborum, which then continues out laterally as the transversalis fascia. So this is sometimes called the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, which remember we talked about from the first unit. The posterior layer, well, that's the part that runs into latissimus dorsi. But pay attention to this middle layer of the thoracolumbar fascia for a minute. Notice that it's actually a fusion of the three aponeuroses from the external, internal obliques, and the transversus abdominis muscle. And as it approaches the erector spinae, it once again splits to completely envelop and fuse to the transverse and spinous processes. So you can imagine as the oblique musculature contracts, it's actually going to pull taut on this fascia and end up squeezing in on the erector spinae group. Now, this is important in certain rehab protocols. I'm sure that you're familiar with core training, and the entire idea of core training to a certain degree is back stabilization. This is the reason why. When you're able to engage your core, as they talk about, or isometrically contract the oblique musculature, it's going to pull on this thoracolumbar fascia, this middle layer, which is going to squeeze in on the erector spinae group, giving it more stabilization and support. So by engaging your core when you have to use the erector spinae group, the idea is that you provide it with a greater level of stabilization. Next, we're going to look at the nerves that come off the posterior abdominal wall. The first we encounter is just underneath the 12th rib. Now, above this, we call these the intercostal nerves. But since there's no nerve below this, it seems kind of inappropriate to do so, so instead we refer to this as the subcostal nerve. This is really just the ventral rami of the 12th thoracic nerve. And as it travels, it's going to actually project inferior from that projection of the subcostal groove and is going to pierce the transversus abdominis muscle running in the neurovascular plane between that and the internal oblique musculature. It eventually will pierce through, giving off a lateral cutaneous branch, and then the remainder of it will continue along to the front, supplying segmental innervation to the oblique musculature, as well as cutaneous sensation in this region below the umbilicus. Inferior to that, we have our iliohypogastric nerve. So this is the branch of a ventral rami off the first lumbar spinal nerve. And again, it's going to pierce through the transversus abdominis muscle, run in this neurovascular plane, and it eventually will provide branches that will give cutaneous sensation to the appropriate dermatome, as well as motor branches segmentally to the muscle fibers of the obliques in this area. Underneath that and closely associated is the ilioinguinal nerve because it's also a branch of L1. This will create some confusion in the anatomy lab because sometimes they will come off completely fused. They may not split until after they pierce the transversus abdominis and so appear as one nerve. And sometimes they will be completely separate and a little bit further apart as they come through. So really you have to map out all the nerves if you want to get a sense of which one is the iliohypogastric versus the ilioinguinal. Ilioinguinal is going to again pierce through the three muscular seats, similar to the previous two nerves that we talked about, and then end up in the hypogastric region as the name implies. So again, segmental motor innervation to the oblique musculature, as well as sensory information to this lower portion of the abdomen. Next on our list is a nerve that we've already identified. This is our lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. So we saw this previously in the thigh, but now we see its initial root here, and we can see how it runs over top of the iliacus muscle, which is how it's so easily identified, and then will run just medial to the anterior superior iliac crest to run into the thigh to supply cutaneous innervation to this lateral portion out to the side here. Next nerve is the easiest to find. That's the femoral nerve. It's tucked in underneath the psoas major, so you do have to reflect the psoas a bit medially to really see it, but there's really no missing it. It's the largest nerve in this region, a very prominent size, and we've already talked about the functions of the femoral nerve after it passes underneath the inguinal canal, so we won't really linger on the point, but this is where you actually will see it in the abdominal pelvic region. The next nerve can be identified because of its branching pattern as it pierces through the anterior surface of the psoas major muscle. This is our genitofemoral nerve. It contains two separate branches, a genital branch that will run into the inguinal canal along with the ilioinguinal nerve and provide cutaneous innervation to the scrotum, once again along with the ilioinguinal nerve, and then a femoral branch that will continue underneath the inguinal ligament and pass into the medial aspect of the thigh to provide some cutaneous innervation to this region. Next nerve is a little bit trickier to identify. This is your obturator nerve. You'll have to pull the psoas major out laterally and dig in deep, but what you'll find is it projects off of the lumbar nerve plexus, L2 through L4, and then it'll project through the obturator foramen. So the way to identify it is it creates sort of like what I call a tightrope appearance, in that as you push down on it, it becomes taut. You won't be able to push it all the way to the bottom. So if you feel through your finger in this region here, you'll feel a very tight banded structure similar to a tightrope that won't push inferiorly. That's going to be your obturator nerve. And again, we already talked about the function, a little bit of cutaneous innervation into the medial aspect of the thigh, and also innervation of the hip adductor group. Having covered all of the nerves, that brings us to the diaphragm. So this is the dome-shaped muscle that we saw that separates out the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It projects more inferior along its dorsal or posterior aspect and remains a little bit more superior along the ventral aspect here, and that's what creates the costodiaphragmatic recess that we talked about before. So this is considered a fibrotendinous sheath. We see a numerous number of these peripheral fibers that are originating from the 12th rib along its course and eventually off of the costal cartilages relative to the sternum and the xiphoid process. And these will converge on this mid-region of sheath that's known as the central tendon. And this radiating appearance of the fibers really explains the function and the mechanism of the diaphragm. Now, I've been teaching this for a while, and I've used this example over and over again. I've taught this in Canada, in the Hamilton region, in Western London, Ontario. I've taught this in Ohio. I've taught this in South Dakota. I'm teaching this here now, and everywhere I've ever taught this, everyone gets this analogy. Think back to when you were in grade school at phys ed and you played with the parachute. And one of the activities that you would do is lifting it up. And you see here they move towards the center and then they pull back as quickly as possible. Well, guess what? That actually eloquently describes the motion of the diaphragm. Every time you take a breath in, normally it's up in this lower position, think of these kids pulling out. These are analogous to these peripheral fibers contracting. So when you breathe in, the fibers contract, they pull on the central tendon, and as you can see, the central tendon gets pulled down. As you relax, the abdominal musculature pushes the central tendon back up. So in this case, the kids are actively doing it, but you would just think of this as being a passive process where the abdominal contents would be pushing up. But the active contraction is very similar to what we see here. Kids pulling back on the parachute, and then the parachute being pulled down. Muscle fibers pulling down on the central tendon, and the central tendon being pulled down. That's how we breathe in. So that's the mechanism of the diaphragm. That's what I want you to keep in mind when you think about these fibers contracting and pulling in this radiating fashion on the central tendon. Also associated with the diaphragm, we have this caval formation in the middle, the caval foramen, I should say. That's where the inferior vena cava is going to push through at typically the level of the 8th thoracic vertebrae. And that's a pretty distinct landmark. So the spot at which the inferior vena cava pierces through the diaphragm, level of T8. We also see as the diaphragm projects off the posterior wall that it actually wraps over top of these muscles that we just talked about, creating these ligamentous formations. So first we have the lateral arcuate ligament, named because it resembles an archway, and that's going to arch over top of the quadratus lumborum muscle that we just talked about. Then we have a medial arcuate ligament, which projects over top of the psoas major. And finally, a median arcuate ligament, which will actually branch over top of the region where the aorta is going to expand through. And on either side of that, the medial arcuate ligament is anchored in place by the left and the right crus, which is the tendinous attachment of the diaphragm to the anterior surface of the bodies of the lumbar vertebrae. So that marks the aortic hiatus. That's going to occur at the level of T12. And one final orifice to identify, we have these fibers which wrap around in a sling formation, and this is where the esophagus is going to emerge. So we call this the esophageal hiatus, and that typically occurs at the level of T10. So note, caval foramen for the inferior vena cava, T8, esophageal hiatus for the esophagus, T10, and aortic hiatus for the aorta, T12. 8, 10, 12. Something to keep in mind for test day. Hint, hint. We can also see some neurovascular structures piercing through. First, we have our inferior phrenic artery, and that's a pair of branches that come off of the diaphragm just above the celiac trunk, which we talked about in the previous lesson. The inferior phrenic veins are then going to drain the area into the inferior vena cava just before it passes through the caval foramen. And then the inferior surface, we can also see some piercing branches of the phrenic nerve that will go through, and as we talked about, these are branches from C3, 4, and 5 to keep the diaphragm alive. Next thing that we have to talk about are the kidneys. So here we see the kidneys along the posterior abdominal wall. So this is part of the urinary system, and we're not going to go too in-depth with this. A lot of physiology and microanatomy that's just not really appropriate for this course. But this is what's going to control the hydration state of the body. It's going to eliminate waste and fluids and closely monitor blood fluid levels. And if they're excessively high, such as from drinking a lot of water, then we're going to increase secretion. And if they're low from a dehydration state, then they're going to decrease the secretion. The other thing to recognize are the suprarenal glands that we see on either side, commonly known as the adrenal glands. This creates a problem for dissection because these have the consistency very similar to the fatty tissue that we'll be talking about. And so it is very common for students to go through and completely rip through the glands as they rip through the fascia trying to find the glands. So you need to be a little bit careful when doing the dissection in this area. We have an outer cortex to these which produces corticosteroids and androgens, and then we have an inner medulla portion which secretes catecholamines. So this is epinephrine and norepinephrine that will be secreted into the blood during the fight or flight response. Keep in mind that these are retroperitoneal structures, meaning the peritoneum is traveling over top of them, and that they are surrounded in dense fascia. Also notice that the right kidney is typically inferior relative to the left, and it's because we have this big old liver sitting on top of it that's kind of pushing it down and keeping it suppressed. Also note that when you see in the cadaver, they'll look like they're pretty fixed in place. You kind of hope so because you're working with a dead body. But in a living individual, when you breathe in and out, these will actually move quite extensively, anywhere from 2 to 3 centimeters as you engage in normal respiratory activity. So here we see their association relative to the posterior abdominal wall, and we can see that they are completely enveloped in fat. We actually have two separate layers. First of all, we have the pararenal fat on the outside, and then we have a fascial connective tissue layer known as the renal fascia. And then finally, we have the perirenal fat on the inside, as well as the internal capsule to the kidney, which is the renal capsule. Now we have these two separate layers of fat, but I'm pretty much guaranteeing when you dissect this, you're not going to appreciate a difference between them. You may get lucky and get within this fascial plane, but really this will come off as one layer. Trust me though, if you looked at this histologically, you will notice that there is two separate layers separated by this fascial plane. So we will take a little bit of time to talk about the internal structure of the kidneys. First, as we said, we have this outer renal capsule that we just identified of connective tissue. And then the kidney, well, it's kidney shaped. How else are you going to really describe this thing? Everything's described as kidney shaped, so you're kind of up the creek with this one. But at this medial region, we see this region known as the hilum, and this is where we see the renal artery and vein come in and the ureter come out. And if we actually cut into this and look on the inside, we actually see that we have a little bit of an empty space in here known as the renal sinus. This is packed with a little bit of fat, and this just represents more of a potential space than anything else. Cutting into the kidney, we'll see this outer portion, which is known as the renal cortex. And then more internally, we see the renal medulla, which is made up of two separate things. We have a series of these, what we call pyramids, that are separated by these columns. The pyramids are significant because this is where fluids, the blood, is filtrated out. And this is where our fluids meant for secretion will collect in this region at the bottom, this tip here of the pyramid, which communicates with this structure known as a minor calyce. So the fluid collects in the minor calyces. Several minor calyces will collect together to form a major calyce, and then the 2 to 3 major calyces that we see within each given kidney will fuse to form the renal pelvis. From here, the fluid will drain out of the renal pelvis into our ureter. So where does the ureter go from here? The ureter is going to travel inferiorly, and that's eventually going to drain in the urinary bladder, which we don't really talk about in this course necessarily. This takes us back to the level of the hilum. So here we can see the renal arteries. And specifically, we have this ureteric branch which comes off that will travel all the way down with the ureter to supply it with some additional nutrients. We also have our inferior suprarenal arteries that will go to the adrenal glands, highly vascular tissue that come directly off the renal arteries. But these also have two other branches as well. We have middle suprarenal arteries that come off of the aorta, and superior suprarenal arteries, which are actually branches off of this inferior phrenic artery that we identified a few minutes ago. So are you going to be able to identify all of these in lab? Probably not. I wouldn't spend too much time taking a look at this, but just recognize that we have extensive vascular supply to these adrenal glands. Our renal veins will drain directly into the inferior vena cava, and note that the left renal vein is much longer because it has to pass over top of the aorta, whereas the right renal vein has a smaller distance to travel to be able to drain the blood back into the inferior vena cava. All right, that's going to do it. So we've basically finished up the abdominal organs, the thoracoabdominal section of the course, believe it or not. I know that was pretty quick. And in the next session, we'll actually start with the head and neck by looking at the various musculature and what we know as the triangles of the neck. So until that time, this has been Dr. Stuart Inglis. Enjoy the rest of your day.